My name is Judy Myers, and I'm the coordinator for the Children's Mental Health Program in the Children, Youth, and Family Consortium. On behalf of the Children's Mental Health Program, I welcome you to this morning's first Lessons from the Field beginning this academic year. We're excited that so many of you have registered and are sharing in this educational experience, both here in Minneapolis and by way of broadcast at over 30 host sites in greater Minnesota. And I have to say, the attendance this year has been phenomenal. Before our speakers begin, I want to take a moment to introduce and thank the other members of our team. Jessica Barnes, our program staff member who helps with much of our day-to-day operation, and Carrie Michaels, who is the program leader of the Children's Mental Health Program, and also Allison Nunnick-Govan, our intern this year. In addition, we have many volunteers both here and as host site coordinators who help this event run more smoothly. We thank all of you. You will have a number of opportunities both this morning and next week to ask our presenters your questions. Today, following the break, there will be a brief time for questions, and then a longer time for questions at noon after the final presentation. We hope that all of you here and in greater Minnesota will stay to participate in that lively discussion. In addition, for those who have questions that come up later, or whose questions are not answered today, we hope you'll post your questions to our website blog. You can find that on our cmh.umn.edu website after today and all next week. You may submit your questions anonymously if you prefer. The following week, we will post all the questions with responses on our website. One additional announcement. Because we're focusing on factors that impact the cognitive and social development of children and youth, I'd like to tell you about an exciting new exhibit at the Science Museum of Minnesota called Wonder Years: The Science of Early Childhood. I've attended this exhibit myself several times, and each time learned something new about early child development. This exhibit is especially relevant as we consider how early brain development impacts cognitive and social learning. I hope if you have an opportunity to visit St. Paul that you'll go to the Science Museum to see this permanent interactive exhibit. The various displays demonstrate how malleable and resilient the brain is to traumatic experiences. I encourage you all to visit this wonderful exhibit and to bring your family and friends. Among your handouts today is the schedule and information about our presenters, so I won't elaborate on that now. You will note that Ann Garrity is not here. While we are meeting this morning, she is in surgery. She sends her sincere regrets. After 3 months of poor progress following knee surgery this past summer, she and her doctor agreed that the only hope of improvement is another knee operation. I know you'll want to keep her in your thoughts. She said this is the only reason she would even consider missing this opportunity. We do hope to have her back for another Lessons from the Field in the future. We are very grateful to Michelle Fallon, Molly Kenny, and Katie Thomas for their willingness to fill in for Ann's part this morning. You won't be disappointed. And now, Michelle Fallon.
The not Ann Garrity. And I'm sorry for that. I want to start out just by asking you to, as we talk throughout this presentation this morning, to think about a couple of things. One is that we're going to be talking about trauma in a very broad definition. I think Ann has been particularly helpful in helping me understand that sometimes when we think about trauma, we automatically jump to mental health and so on and so forth. When when we came together, Anne and Molly and I, to develop the Nursery Way, Anne helped us really understand there's a difference between trauma and trauma effects. Okay, so we don't need to know what the trauma is. What we are seeing and what we are responding to and what we're developing a program around is what we believe to be the possible effects of trauma, or at a minimum of significant stress. So Molly will be talking about the crisis nursery, but that would be a place where if children are, we assume they're very stressed, if for no other reason they're separated from their caregivers, their primary caregivers. So, and then the other thing is, because we're thinking of this trauma and stress in a very broad way and thinking about this, as we go through today, let's not just think about the children. We're talking about biology. So we're talking about ourselves as adults, as caregivers. So when we think about how do we develop programs to address this, we have to hold not only the needs of the children and their parents, but also the staff who are working with these children and families. So again, just as we go through this, be thinking on all of those levels that what we're talking about children, but it really applies to all of us. So we want to talk about 4 assumptions, and I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. I'm just going to kind of, where Anne was going to do, just try to create a framework for what we're going to talk about in terms of the trauma lens that we tried to adapt to working with the children and families at the crisis nursery. Development is transactional. So what we mean by that is that the child is an active participant virtually from birth in eliciting the responses in their environment. And that becomes very important when we think about what are the experiences that the children that we're working with may have had. What has influenced the way they respond in their environment and the trajectory their development is on. But the good news is, and Katie Thomas is going to talk about this in much more detail, we can impact those trajectories. So if a child's experience is, I haven't been responded to consistently, I don't ask for much, or I ask for things in a way that's pretty maladaptive and people experience as difficult, that's a response to, I've had to accommodate that style of interacting because of my experiences. So what experiences can we provide that can move that developmental trajectory back on track? Because if a child has had those experiences, that's the way they're going to learn to elicit responses, and those responses are just going to reinforce the trajectory we're on. So we want to figure out how we can affect developmental trajectories in the most positive way. So some of the ways that transactional developmental thing works is that kids will behave in ways that elicit those familiar responses. So for example, if I'm a young child that's growing up with a parent who's depressed, I may have learned that in order to get on the radar, to get my needs met, my behavior has to hit a threshold that's well above and beyond what would be considered typical behavior. And that's an adaptive response to my circumstances. And so I'm going to come into new situations behaving in that exact way to get what I think is, that's the way I get my needs met. And so I'm going to make choices when I go into new situations that are going to reinforce what I believe in terms of how the world works. And I'm going to interpret, and this is really important for us working with these kids, I'm going to interpret new situations that I don't understand to match to match my experience. So Katie's going to be talking about some really wonderful work by a researcher named Seth Pollack that looks at how children interpret pictures of neutral faces. Abused children tend to look, if there's a face that has no emotion showing on it, they will tend to interpret that as angry or negative or threatening, because that's their perception based on experience. So sometimes we get responses from young children in stressful situations or who have experienced trauma and kind of toxic stress situations that are very confusing to us. You know, what just happened is about this big, and this kid is responding like this. You know, and it can be very confusing for adults and very challenging which gets back to how we get aroused in those situations as well. So our second assumption is that relationships are key. Again, what we're saying here is that biologically we are wired to be in relationship. As human beings, our survival, the survival of the species, and again, Katie will go into this in more detail, but our survival of the species depends on our ability to keep in close proximity to a caregiver. Because without that, because our human infants are born so helpless and are helpless for such a prolonged time. So in contrast to animals that are born on the prairie, where I'm a wild horse, I have to be on my feet and able to run with the herd within 2 hours because my survival depends on it. Our human beings, our survival depends on that ability to stay close. So I come wired to need relationships in order for development to occur. And thankfully, as adults, most of us are wired to respond to that. So how many of you, when you pick up a baby, you find yourself swaying back and forth? Why do you do that? I don't know, but I do it. Sometimes I do it when I watch other people hold babies. But that's just an example of how we are literally wired to be in those relationships. And this is where I really want us to focus. This self-regulation as a cornerstone of early development, that's a quote coming from Neurons to Neighborhoods, with which many of you may be familiar. But when we think about the developmental progression of regulation, the newborn infant has no capacity to regulate their level of arousal, their emotions, their behavior, their attention. They are completely dependent on the caregiver to do that kind of regulation. Now, remember that brain is developing based on experience. And so as time goes by, within a few short months, with optimal kinds of conditions, that child is beginning to participate more and more in that regulation. So if we have a 4-month-old baby who's had responsive care the majority of the time, you know, I'm cooking dinner and the baby starts to fuss, and I go, I know, just a second, you're hungry. And that child, by 4 or 5 months of age, that child has the capacity to settle, to take on some of that regulatory capacity because the experiences have wired the brain in a way to be able to do that because they've been able to count on that. So again, there's this emerging child participation into what becomes genuine shared regulation. Think toddlers, right? So the toddler, you know, has more and more capacity to regulate themselves under certain conditions, and in a nanosecond, they can go over the edge, and they require us as caregivers to come back in, and you know, which is part of why toddlers are so challenging for many of us, because I know she can do it. Well, she can't do it right now when she's experiencing this degree of stress. But so that shared regulation is essential. And then by the time we get to preschool, we're kind of expecting kids to have what we call guided self-regulation. So we know that preschool children in group care need, you know, routines, and we set up the environment to optimize children's ability to regulate themselves. So that's the guided part. And we may have to cue them, is that how we treat our friends? Or whatever, you know, the cues are. But self-regulation, we really can't expect that until a child is well into school age. And then remember that all of this changes when we're stressed. So my ability to regulate myself is going to be affected by a stressful event. That's true for us as adults as well. But we tend to intervene when on guided self-regulation. We tend to expect that if a child is of preschool age, that they should have that capacity. But what if a child is being cared for by caregivers that themselves are not regulated? If I, as a caregiver, as an adult, have experienced significant trauma, or I'm living in very, very stressful situations, how can I provide that regulation for my child? And so how is my child going to learn? So sometimes our expectations of older children, preschool children, are, you know, we're not thinking about the fact that there are these big gaps. All of this has to build on itself. So that theme will come up over and over this morning while we're talking about the nursery way and how we want to take this lens of, I wonder what's going on here, and interpreting children's behavior, this trauma lens, as it were, to interpret what we're seeing when we work with young children and families. And then finally, this notion that, the Donald Winnicott's saying there's no such thing as a baby, meaning that babies cannot exist. They cannot survive outside of a relationship with a caregiver, a nurturing caregiver. And so if we want to work with children, young children in particular, to be most effective, we have to have the caregiver in mind as well. And so in developing the nursery way, and this is where Molly will go on about how do we work with the child and provide what we feel like the child needs based on what we're seeing. At the same time, we're providing services to the parent based on what we're seeing, and the parent tells us they need. But we can be most effective when we're working on the relationship between the parent and the child. So that's where the team comes in, and we'll talk about that more. But just that, again, as for those of us who go into these fields because we care about young children, we get about this much time in a child's life, right? And the family gets forever. So, if we want to get the bang for our buck, we think about the child in the context of the caregiver. You know all that. I just wanted to go over really quickly what our assumptions were. So again, Katie's going to be talking about this in much more detail, but and you have a handout on early brain development and caregiving that has some specific information on how stress impacts it. And that handout was written for child care providers. So again, we're talking about stress. Children get stressed. Children get stressed when they're separated from caregivers and for a number of other reasons. And so, but just briefly, we know that the brain develops from the bottom up. So the child, the brain stem, the part of the brain that has to do with keeping us alive is what's obviously most well developed at birth. That brain development occurs as a combination of genetics, kind of what we come with, our hardwiring, and experience. And that the brain development is not complete until we're in our mid-20s, and dang, I wish I had known that when I was raising adolescents. Did not know that. So one of the things and so we're talking about the big star, we're talking about kind of the part of the brain that has to do with regulation here. And so one of the things that we often see is the phenomenon of but I know she knows better. Does that the dreaded biting toddler in group care? Do we bite our friends? No bite, And then someone pulls that book out of her hands, chomp. Well, that's biology. Because the brain, the frontal lobe, where we do our problem solving, anticipating consequences, all of that stuff, that's the last part of the brain to develop. And from a stress perspective, when we're aroused, that part of our brain, that thinking part of our brain, tends to shut down just to ensure our survival. And that happens to us, more or less, depending on our temperament here. But my example is I'm driving to the car wash. My 18-month-old is in the car seat behind me. And somebody pulled right in front of me, and I let fly a word, folks, that if those synapses had been holding hands between that arousal part and my thinking brain, that word would not have come out in my mouth with my toddler in the back seat. He proceeded to repeat it with perfect inflection for at least a week. But that's an example of under stress, it's different. It's different. Our ability, and so when we think about kids who may not have those underpinnings of shared regulation, it helps us understand behavior. It helps us understand why that 2-year-old bit when someone took her book, when she knows better. So I think we covered this. I think we have lots of evidence to support this. In the 80s and early 90s, we had the example of the Romanian orphanages where children's physical needs were being met and yet they didn't have the opportunity for relationship, and their developmental trajectories were profoundly impaired to varying degrees without that human relationship, because again, all early learning takes place within that context. So children need us to organize their experiences as well as their level of arousal. And when you think about this, we do this when we're with young children all the time. Have you ever taken a toddler to the Mall of America? And again, we're temperament and all kinds of things come in here. But as caregivers, we want to be mindful of what's happening in the environment that this child can tolerate. If I have a young baby and I'm taking them into a noisy environment and the baby begins to fuss, hopefully I know that I need to tamp down this stimulation a little bit. It's why the Academy of Developmental of Pediatrics comes out with 2-year-olds, children under 2 shouldn't watch TV. It's, besides being passive, it's there's too much stimulation for them to tolerate. And so we are constantly moderating, buffering children from what's going on in the environment so that it can be at a level where they can be successful. So it's enough stimulation, but not too much stimulation. Intense enough to be interesting, not so intense that it makes me too aroused to learn from it. So that's just part of that dance that we do on a regular basis. So when we think about stress, and if you don't already know it, I really want to wave a flag for the website on the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, and some of our very own Minnesota rock stars like Megan Gunner are featured on that. Wonderful downloadable working papers. There are video clips to talk about toxic stress. It's a really awesome website, and it's referenced on your Nursery Way handout in your packet. But basically, stress is not all bad. We need stress to promote development. I don't know about you, but I have found in group care, 5-month-old babies, more or less, can be challenging to care for. They're aware enough, they're alert enough, they're social enough that, ooh, I want to get in there, I want to do it, and I can't move, and I can't even sit up, so I can't grab things with my hands. And so you often see before a major leap in development, a period of irritability, a period of fussiness. That's that positive stress. It's that frustration that moves us to the next level, right? So we're not saying children should never be stressed. Without that degree of positive stress, we won't learn. Tolerable stress is that's unavoidable. Life happens, but the difference is we consider stress to be tolerable when there's enough social support to see a child through it, okay? I think an example of that would be Megan Gunner's cortisol studies, where they had assigned children through the strange situation as secure or insecurely attached, followed them to the doctor's office. You know, the toddlers get shots. Both toddlers are crying. Can't really tell them apart, but I'm going to measure their cortisol, that stress hormone that's easily measured in kids because it's excreted in the saliva. The child who is securely attached has a barely elevated cortisol level, stress hormone, whereas the child who's insecurely attached, who has not had that consistent experience of somebody watching my back, their cortisol levels, that stress hormone, is much higher under the same circumstances. So literally, the brain is beginning to wire in a way that is creating more or less resiliency in that child based on the social supports and the confidence that I'm going to feel better. So when we have toxic stress, we're talking about that prolonged, excessive, stressful situations without adequate adult support. Because remember, we're wired to be in relationships. So if I don't have the confidence that I've got that support, that's where we get worried that those stress hormones like cortisol get elevated, stay elevated, and the brain wires, instead of it becoming a state of heightened arousal, it becomes a trait. This child is hyper-aroused based on their experience and as a survival mechanism. So again, we don't need to necessarily, when we think about how we're going to apply this to practice, we don't necessarily need to know what the stress or the trauma is. It can be very helpful to know it. But oftentimes, if we're careful observers, the children will tell us by their behavior. They'll give us enough information that we can respond in the most helpful way. So I think the little guy that was the best teacher for me to understand this is I used to work in Preschool Day Treatment, which was a milieu for children, preschool children, who were diagnosed as having significant social, emotional behavior problems. Most of them had been or were in the foster care system, so most of them had experienced fairly significant neglect and abuse. Not all of them, but most of them. So there's a little guy named Michael who's 3 years old, and he was about 1 week into the program. And Michael was had been placed with his maternal aunt, who recently removed from his mother's care because his mother had issues with chemical dependency and mental health, and he had been living in an environment where there was drug dealing going on, lots of in and out. So we can assume this is a child who had experienced, at a minimum, fairly significant neglect and probably abuse. So we're in the gym, which is almost as big as this room, and there's balls and bikes and things are going all over the place, and I mean, there's lots to do in this room. And Michael is as far across the gym from me as he could be. And I went like this and rubbed my eyes, and he screamed across the room, "Michelle, why are you crying?" Well, first of all, why is he even looking at me? I am the least interesting thing in this room, right? And why, because I went like this, does he assume I'm crying? Well, based on that, we can develop a reasonable hunch that Michael's survival to that point depended on, one, knowing where the person in charge is, and secondly, what kind of a mood is she in? He is literally wired. He is so hypervigilant of all of that he can't take advantage of the opportunity to socialize with the other kids, to play with all the stuff that's available to him. Now, you know, just to reduce anxiety and stress, he was adopted by his aunt. After a year in day treatment and in his new home, this little guy looked completely different. But again, that would be an example of how the body stays activated to accommodate to danger and fear. He was in survival mode all of the time, and so that really compromises his ability to take advantage of the learning that we have to offer him. So again, Katie's going to go into this, but again, this is off the website that I was talking about. Just, you know, the evidence that how literally affected the brain is by this toxic level of stress, which we're equating in this context to trauma as well. So this can take a variety of, this can look different for different children based on their experiences, based on their temperament, you know, a lot of the risk and protective factors, which are going to be different, which is why we, you know, one of the key principles here is that we have to look at each child individually. We can't make assumptions because children respond so differently in different situations. But I like to think about, and we're going to get to the strategies here when Molly gets up. But another example of this from my day treatment days was a little guy named David who had witnessed very violent domestic abuse of his mother, and on a rather, I'm sorry to say, prolonged basis. And one day we're back in the infamous gym, and a child fell off a bike, and it hurt, and the child cried, was very distressed, and David ran all the way across the gym and began kicking the child who was down on the floor crying. And as a caregiver, that's a horrifying thing to see. I mean, it feels barely comprehensible. But when we think about, the advantage of having known some of David's experience, what we know is that that was a little guy who, in that moment, that would have been a trauma trigger for him. To hear that sound of distress, for him, triggered such tremendous terror that his automatic response was to get big. I'm going to be big, and I'm going to be aggressive because I'm so terrified. And it's a form almost of dissociation. We can say he's in flight mode or in fight mode, but that's a child who that act of aggression was almost dissociational, if that makes sense. So that was his automatic response that was not in his conscious mind. And so if we respond to David as, what kind of a little monster are you that you would kick this child who's just fallen off a bike, as opposed to, oh, that is so scary. It's so scary when people cry. We're going to keep you safe. Now, mind you, someone else has got the bike accident, got a kid over here. We're going to keep you safe. We're going to keep him safe. We're not going to kick, because that's way too scary. But again, to address to understand that as a response to underlying terror as opposed to a child who's simply a bully. So that would be an example. And then these perceptual distortions. Again, that, if you look, if a child bumps into me, if my experience is that I get hurt, that anybody touching me is an aggressive move, and that triggers that response, then somebody tripping behind me and falling into me, wham! I'm going to assume that person's trying to hurt me, as opposed to, whoa, what happened? Are you okay? So again, it's those perceptual distortions that happen that I'm going to interpret anything ambiguous as consistent with the experiences that I've had. So that's where we get these pretty desperate solution-seeking kinds of things, so that children who have experienced significant trauma and interpret the world through that experience actually become at risk for abuse, because they will tend to perpetuate those behaviors, those learned behaviors that, I'm going to get big, and that's a survival thing. And so they're going to be the child who really is confusing to take care of, really is hard to understand, makes us feel incompetent, makes us feel confused. And so that's where this child's accommodation, based on his experience, has become very maladaptive and results in his being able to completely reinforce and recreate what he most fears. Even for those of us who feel like we're pretty competent, have you had the experience of working with a child that made you feel really incompetent? Oh, good. I'm not the only one. That's what we're talking about. So again, if we take that trauma lens and try to look at it through that way, that what we're seeing are trauma effects, that this is a child who's accommodating to his experience, it's going to give us more information about how we can respond in a way to be more helpful to the child. So again, just reinforcing, we don't need to know the trauma, but we want to understand the effects of it. And again, the more we know, the more, can elicit our empathy, can give us more information. The fact that I knew David had witnessed domestic violence certainly helped us understand his extreme behavior much more quickly. But and again, this is where Anne's, and I do want to reference Anne's developmental repair model here, if you all are familiar with that she wrote while she was at Washburn, I think with a Bush grant. It's available online through Washburn. Fabulous, fabulous. But the first thing we want to do is to join with an individual child and to understand that we cannot assume. We have to see each child individually. So as I think we've made clear, that trauma or this toxic stress literally changes how children see the environment. And that can be so confusing to us coming into it. And so when we looked at that, we kind of took this into account, thinking now about what do the children at the crisis nursery need? We tried to use this to inform it, and this is where, you know, having Anne's understanding of the research and so forth was so helpful, because it was about how do we help children in this context, this very discrete environment. How do we help them understand what happens to them in the here and now? We don't have to reference the past, but if we work with children in the here and now using this trauma lens, we can respond to them in the here and now, and that in and of itself for young children can be very, very useful. So that takes us to, at the nursery, what we're trying to do, yes, the children can stay there for up to 3 days, but we're trying to create a situation or a space, an experience for children, as I said, in the here and now, where if we can reduce that level of arousal through a number of strategies that Molly's going to be talking about, then we're hopefully opening them up to having more experiences of competence and mastery, and the only way we can do that is to give kids a very clear message. This is how it works here. At the nursery, da-da-da-da-da-da, whatever the message is. It isn't saying this is the way the world should be. It's just saying at the nursery, you can expect help here. So by providing that kind of predictability, that kind of security, our hope is we're creating a space for that child that they can take that with them over time. If this is the way it works here, then maybe there are other places where I can expect help. Maybe there are other places where it works like this, so that when a child goes to kindergarten, despite what the majority of their experiences may be within their family who may be experiencing multiple challenges, we've created a space, a framework, a little blueprint of the possibility for another way to think about relating to adults, i.e. school, kindergarten, and other significant relationships. So, with that, that brief framework about how we're thinking about stress and trauma and brain development in this context, introduce Molly Kenny, who is the Family Services Director at the Crisis Nursery.
Well, good morning, everybody. She really makes it make sense for us, doesn't she? I have had the wonderful pleasure of working with Michelle and Ann for about the last 2.5 years. And so I think what I'll do is just kind of give you a really brief overview about what the nursery is. Again, I don't want this to be about it's about how we did it at the nursery, but it's intended to be portable to other places as well. So as you're hearing it, think about ways that you guys can be implementing these same strategies, because it definitely, we are kind of the poster children. If we can do it at the nursery, I think you can do it just about anywhere. So, and then I'm going to just talk a little bit about what that process looked like, how it even evolved, and kind of some of the strengths and challenges that we met along the way. So can everybody hear me? I'm not, okay, perfect. So I think we want to start just by saying what the mission of the Crisis Nursery is, and our mission is to end child abuse and neglect, and knowing full well that in order to do that, we have to prevent child abuse and neglect. We provide an early intervention for that. So our model is much more a preventative model. We recognize that it really does take a village. So we need to contract with other agencies and do this in the context of relationship with others, because this is a big challenge and we can't do it alone. So that's kind of where we're starting from. And what we provide, the services that we can provide at the nursery, is kind of a 24-hour crisis line, which is really our point of entry. Families access our services. It's voluntary, so they choose to call us and ask for help in a variety of ways. One of those may be they need overnight care for their children for a short amount of time. Again, that's voluntary. They're choosing it. We can also offer other strategies to help de-escalate whatever crisis they are experiencing. If they do choose to access our overnight residential care, part of that care includes a basic needs assessment for all of the families. And it's pretty intensive. It goes through a variety, about 10 different areas that we address issues that may be causing their stress. And also, then we also provide resources to help alleviate those stresses. Our staff, our family advocate staff, are very, very well versed and very knowledgeable about all the different resources in the community. We serve all of Hennepin County, and as you know, it's a pretty big place, and our families are very challenged, and so many of them don't have transportation. So not only do staff need to know about all the different options in the different areas of stressors, but also within the geographic areas, different locations that do work with the population that we serve. We also provide parent support and education, which is a key factor in reducing abuse and neglect, and then home visiting, which has also been proven to be a very, very positive strategy for really high-risk families. Just want to mention briefly kind of the profile of the families that we serve and how it mirrors the population of families that are at risk of abuse and neglect. As we all know, what those risk factors are, extreme poverty. Our families their representative income is about 90% of them live on less than $10,000 a year. So they are coming to us extremely challenged. They are very isolated. Not many parents would just pick up the phone and call a total stranger and ask for help. So these families don't have the social supports, the informal social supports in their community, in their families, in their churches, in their neighborhoods, to be able to rely on people that they know well. So these are families that are very, very isolated, which is another high risk factor for abuse and neglect. I want to clarify, I'm not saying that our families are abusing and neglecting their children. I think we're trying to get them before, and then to build them up and support them in that process. I just kind of want to make sure that people understand the population that we're serving, because they are extremely challenged and pretty disenfranchised from other agencies and other organizations that they have tried to work with in the past. I think it's really important to think about these families in the context of what Michelle was talking about brain development and trauma, because many of them did not receive any kind of support or to be able to develop and to learn those regulation skills. So I come to this work more from a family's perspective, incorporating the child and the parent, but did a lot of work with the parents through home visiting and really recognize that these families, their regulation skills are pretty maladaptive. And so we need to look at that as well, because that's the only way we're gonna achieve our mission. So Katie will talk more about how that affects learning as well. So it really has lots of impacts on our work. So our organizing principles, kind of our framework, our groundwork, is we have a strengths-based perspective. I think everybody kind of understands what that means, but in the context of this work, it's really about empowering the parents to kind of regain some control over their lives. They're coming to us in crisis, pretty vulnerable, and so we need to help them kind of regain some of that control, and also to foster some resilience. As Michelle mentioned, and as Katie will mention, and as we all know, this work can't happen without the context of the relationship. So all of this learning, all of these changes that we're trying to kind of have impact on does have to happen within the context of the relationship. So that is key to this work. And it's a constant reminder for us, okay, the relationship, strengthen the relationship. How are we working on that? How are we doing that? And we do it from the moment the parent calls. The parent identifies what the crisis is, and so we're not triaging based on that crisis. The parent, we validate their feelings. We acknowledge the courage that it took to call us from the minute they call, and it's recognizing that. It's recognizing that they want what's best for their children. They sometimes don't always show that, but they do want what's best for their children, and that's why they're picking up the phone and giving us a call. So that's how we start to develop that relationship. We also, like I said, the collaboration piece is really, really critical. So we do a lot of work with a lot of the other agencies that serve this same population, and we partner with them. We try to figure out ways that we can meet these families' needs together and really respond to both the family and the children's needs in a really positive manner. And then obviously children's needs come first, and everyone that walks through the door of the nursery knows that, and so all of our focus becomes that. And it's gotten even better since we started doing some of this trauma-informed work. So I just want to remind everybody that that all of the strategies that we talk about in order to prepare to be more trauma-informed, they're relational, and it's really dependent on a deep respect for the families and a genuine passion for doing this kind of work and feeling pretty privileged to be able to be invited into these families' worlds. So hopefully, and if not, there's a great website, but the five protective factors are kind of what has really helped us to develop a system for trauma-informed care. It's what we use when we developed our logic model to create outcomes so that we could prove that to funders and things like that this was actually working. And for brief overview, the 5 protective factors is from the Strengthening Families Initiative and has been demonstrated to reduce abuse and neglect. So we know the risk factors. What are some of the things that we can do to kind of alleviate some of those risk factors and help strengthen families? Parental resilience is a really strong one. That's where we kind of bring in the crisis line, where we bring in strategies to help them cope, where we do those kind of things. The social connections, helping them to kind of identify. Maybe they're not aware of some people in their community that might be supportive. It's also, so it's informal supports that we help to kind of identify for them. It's also using us is a social connection. Asking us for help is a more formal connection, and that's good. That's inviting people into their lives and reducing the stress that they're experiencing. The knowledge of parenting and child development is one that we, up until the last few years, while we were fully aware of it, and our child care staff did a really good job in working with the kids while they were in our care, we didn't take that to the next level as much as far as informing the parents about child development. We recognized, I think, from a pretty high level that our parents probably didn't have the best parenting and so didn't have the greatest knowledge of child development. But we also kind of had to hold that at the same time with they're experiencing some pretty significant acute crisis, and how can they deal with that when they don't have a place to live, or how can they deal with that when they can't put food on the table, or when their child's in the hospital, all the different reasons that they call us. So we kind of always put that one to the side and thought, okay, well, we're doing the other 4, maybe we can maybe we can leave that to others, and that is part of the community collaboration piece. But I guess I would like to say that's where when I was doing home visiting, really recognized the challenges of the parents and how they couldn't meet the needs of their children, and what that feels like as a parent, as a provider, what that feels like to know what you want for your child and not to be able to respond to them. So I was at a conference, and I can tell you a little bit more about that, but about bringing that knowledge of parent and child development. It kept kind of reoccurring in my work, and I just thought, we need to figure out a way to make that happen. And then the 5th one is the social and emotional competence in children that we do now, and we'll talk about more in depth. So I was doing some home visiting. I had kind of left that work. I started at the nursery about 9 years ago and started in the home visiting field. And some of the challenges that I had experienced with the parents, or witnessed the parents experiencing, really led me to this next stage. I was working with a family whose young daughter had been sexually abused by her cousin. And this family was fairly intact given the risk factors that they were presenting with. And mom had done a lot of work with mom and dad, had found them some housing, had gotten dad some substance abuse help. Mom was starting school. So it really started to work on some things that would lift them out of their current situation. And this child, mom and dad recognized that the child had been sexually abused, and it shattered their world, as it should. But to a point where Dad, at the time I had no idea, but Dad's regulation had shut down and went off on the guy. And police came, child witnessed the police. Dad was very belligerent with the police. Child witnessed the police putting him on the floor, with the foot on the floor, with the gun, And it was an extremely traumatic experience for this child. So she was actually re-traumatized by this event, and how horrific for her. She didn't know that what Dad was what his experience was. We were taking her to some therapy, and while we were in the waiting room, the little girl kind of commanded me down on the floor, and just wanted to reenact that event. And it was so shocking for me, and I felt so ill-equipped to be present for her. But I was present because I had the relationship with her. But I knew that there was so much more we could be doing. So those were, experiences like that I know it sounds horrible, and it was horrible. And it was, as Michelle mentioned, it's hard for all of us in different ways. So I was, shortly after that, a year after that, whatever, I was at a training that Bruce Perry was doing on trauma, and Ann was moderating it. And I had been to a number of different conferences that Ann had presented at. And I just have talked to her over the years, and we're pretty connected, and just asked her, what more, she's very familiar with the nursery, what more can we be doing at the nursery? I know there's more we can be doing. But I was thinking of it more from the parents' perspective, like how can we help these parents understand the needs of these children? And she was thinking of it from, well, what can we be doing with the kids while they're there? We joined forces and started talking about this. She introduced us to Michelle and suggested that Michelle would be a really, really key person to help us train our staff to become more trauma-informed. What does it look like for these kids? Our staff recognized all along, the child care staff, the family advocate staff recognized all along that we were dealing with stress, but not to the effect that we really were. So we identified some outcomes that we'll talk about a little bit later, but the key here was just really recognizing that there needed to be a shift, and that it needed to include trauma care and the experience of the child.
So why a nursery way? You'll see the word humility throughout the PowerPoint as we go forward. And let me give you a story about that. That right off the bat, Molly invites me to the nursery. And it required real acknowledgement and constant acknowledgement to the staff on an ongoing way how unique this work is. Caring for children at the crisis nursery, translate, caring for children who have experienced significant stress and trauma, is different than other kinds of care. It's different than child care. For example, if my child is in child care, they're familiar with the child care provider. They have with that person probably 5 days a week. They know the routine. They know there's an ongoing, grounding, secure, hopefully kind of relationship, depending on the quality of the child care. So that's a very different thing than the nursery, where children are coming and going literally 24 hours a day and staying for up to 3 days. And so we don't have baseline with those kids, right? I mean, we don't know, is this temperament? Is this a reaction to something that happened? Is this, so we're gonna have to make some assumptions because we don't know that, and the child doesn't know us. There are three shifts at the nursery. It's 24-hour care. So they go to bed at night, they're put to bed by one staff, they wake up the next morning and it's a new shift of staff. So how do we help children understand that experience? So I'm invited as the mental health professional who has some experience in child care. And Molly takes me down to the gym and she introduces me, and right away a little girl runs up to me and says, "Hi, can I have a hug? Can I have a hug?" And I, in my best I should teach this child boundaries way, because I'm a mental health professional, early childhood mental health professional. I take a step back, I extend my hand and say, you don't know me well enough for a hug. How about if we shake hands? And I'm thinking, am I modeling or what? So Molly was very diplomatic. We've just met each other. We leave the gym and she says, you know, actually we need to ask the children to trust every adult within these walls. It's like, oh, this is different, isn't it? So that was my immediate introduction to how unique this is, and how, again, we have to take the lens and we have to accommodate it. And there are kids who are there for the first time. There are kids who are there and they love it. It's like coming to camp. They come so often. I mean, so the range is just tremendous. So again, it's very unique. And this has implications for how we work with the staff also, because so often it's different than parenting. The strategies that you may use with your children at home probably are not the strategies that are going to be most helpful here. So are you telling me I'm raising my kids wrong? Nope, not telling you that at all. That's really appropriate when you're caring for your own kids. These are children who are, at a minimum, extremely stressed because they're separated from their caregivers, and may, in all likelihood, have experienced a number of other kinds of serious stressors based on the fact that they're here at the crisis nursery, families dealing with multiple challenges. So that becomes an ongoing theme as we go forward, talking about how we work with staff to move this into a trauma-informed kind of a lens. So again, this is just reinforcing the point that hopefully we've made, that the children and the parents who come are very stressed. Now, what we know about that is that also creates a window of opportunity. When we're stressed, we experience things in a different way. We remember things differently. Memory gets encoded differently when we're under real significant stress. So that this is actually a real window of opportunity, potentially, for parents and children to experience things in a new way that's going to be sort of encoded, potentially in a more powerful way because of that stress. So it is a real opportunity for growth and change. And it's this notion, as Molly has said, that, you know, okay, it's 3 days, but this can be part of a larger intervention if we think of it. If we're very intentional in how we think about what we're doing in these 3 days, this can be part of a new, again, thinking about that developmental trajectory for both the parent and the child. If we can give them a new set of experiences under, you know, this climate of kind of their stress in the moment, then we can begin to affect that developmental trajectory and what they might be able to experience or expect in other settings as well. And to access, as Molly said, that continuum of care. These are families who may be considered very difficult to engage because they have had, by and large, very negative experiences with other institutional kinds of situations. Educational, maybe child protection, maybe they're on AMFIP, other kind of institutional experiences. These are families that tend to be marginalized. And yet, as Molly said, they've come to the crisis nursery asking for help. So it's a powerful port of entry, because they made the call, and we do everything we can to empower them, to give them a sense of they have some control and some sense of predictability and some social support in this situation. And that's included in a handout that you have there too. So
Michelle and I kind of do a tag team when we do all of these trainings, so we hope it's okay. We've developed quite a system.
And we interrupt each other.
We interrupt each other all the time. Yeah, what about this? What about this? Took me everything to not interrupt her and say, oh, but don't forget. But anyways.
You can do it.
No. Did you have a question? Or?
Yeah, I was wondering if you can just quickly talk about the population, like the ages.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. The question is, what age range do we serve, basically, and what, you know, more than kind of their demographic profile, but we can care at the nursery. We care for children birth to 6 and their families. So, but again, remember that it's just an opportunity. There's all sorts of other ways that this work can be incorporated. But so this is all, you know, infant to 6 years old. So all of the preschool early learning stuff. Good question. I'm sorry I didn't. A variety. You know, a lot of our families are African American, Native American, Caucasian, less so the Hmong population and less so the Latino population, which is something that we've recognized. The question was cultural backgrounds. Sorry about that. And that's an area that we are working towards figuring out what can we be doing differently. Maybe they need a different kind of care response. So,
But some
African descent,
immigrant
yes,
children,
yeah.
yes.
And primarily
Somali.
single women. So the other population that we really want to start to figure out how we can engage is men, fathers. So that's kind of the next step. Now that we're getting some of this groundwork done, we're looking at who we currently aren't serving, because there's definitely needs in that area too. We can't end child abuse and neglect if we're only serving a small proportion of the population. So really good question, and I apologize for not responding to that earlier. Is it okay?
How does a typical person find out about your nursery?
We have a number of different ways that we do outreach, but
The question
is how do people find out about us? It's through word of mouth. It's through different agencies that we connect pretty intentionally with. It's through their doctor's offices, hospitals, mental health agencies. I think we're going to take more questions after a break. So I really appreciate your guys' energy and enthusiasm about this work. And if you want to write down questions, we're going to take some time after the break to respond to all of those questions. So we want to kind of keep this thing moving, because we got a lot to say in a very short amount of time. So I think what the main point of this slide is just to acknowledge kind of where the shift started to happen. And it wasn't that we weren't doing good work. We were really thinking about the kids, we were really thinking about the parents, but we weren't as intentional about kind of providing that and being open and honest about what we were actually doing. So the intentionality was a big piece of it, and also kind of really focusing on the trauma piece was the other really big piece. Assuming that everybody that walked through our doors, for no other reason than they had experienced a separation between their parent and child. But again, these families didn't experience their first crisis and call us. These are families that have had chronic stress throughout their lives, and who probably were raised in a chronic stress environment. So,
And I think, again, I just want to keep pointing out this, you can expect help here. When we talked about, remember that the kind of progression, the developmental progression of regulation, that's really, so it's a matter of turning this model of caring for kids, caring for them well, into letting the staff know, you know what, whether you're a family services or children's services, you are now a regulating partner. That's where the trauma piece comes in here. We are regulating partners. Our message is to the parent and to the child, you can expect help here, whether it's to help you feel less worried, you know, any variety of things, but that's almost like a mantra. You can expect help here, and help in a number of ways and levels, and a lot about just regulating, organizing.
A good example of that is early on when we had first started this work, and this was the message from a pretty early point. I was in one of the child care rooms, and a little guy I think he was 4, had just separated from his mom and was just inconsolable, crying and crying and crying and crying, just, you know, battering and very, very upset. And before, staff might be, you know, well-intentioned. It's okay, you know, don't worry about it. We're going to do all these fun things, and really trying to fix the problem. Where now that this work had started to become infused in our brains and in how we function, it became, you're really sad. You're really going to miss your mom, aren't you? What do you think your mom's thinking about right now? And so it got him. It acknowledged his emotions, named his emotions. And it started, it took a little bit, but started to calm him down. We could bring that back to mom and say, "God, he was really sad to leave you, but we told him, you're coming back. We acknowledged his feelings. We helped him think about you and told him you're thinking about him." So it's kind of that, it seems small and kind of intricate, but it really, the intentionality behind it really can make a difference. And staff can start to feel more competent, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But he was learning how to cope in a different way, and he was feeling that we got what he was dealing with. So, sorry about that, Michelle. I think we developed these goals together, and with a lot of Anne's support based on research. So these are our primary goals that we also developed our outcomes from, but offering that immediate safety for children. I don't think we really need to go through all of this because it's in your packets, but these were the things that we knew would make a difference. So,
but I do want to just point out this providing developmental support. That's a shift for staff. This is a 4-year-old. I should be, what do we do if we're caregivers of 4-year-olds? Chances are we're doing a lot of work with promoting self-help skills, right? Not here. It's sort of helping staff understand developmentally, this child, first of all, may not be at that level, or he may be, but as stressed as he is in our setting, we got to meet him where he's at. We got to meet him where he's at, and that's a very different perspective than most child care providers have been trained in. So again, that's where the kind of trauma lens. So that, just to point that out, but that again, that focus on trauma-focused care is really developmentally focused care with an appreciation for the effects of stress.
And an understanding of how that plays out in the child's actions. Again, helping the parents understand some of this feedback became much more intentional as well, helping the parents understand more about child development, that we'll talk about specific strategies for how we did that. Again, it was a little bit of a challenge to get there because of the stressors that the families are currently experiencing, and our role is crisis intervention, and we needed to be constantly reminded of that. But the end goal is, if we're going to end abuse and neglect, our parents can become a resource for us if we help them along, if we help them to provide the support, help them to understand some of the basic child development milestones and things like that. So the paradigm shift, I guess, is what we really wanted to recognize through this, and creating that new meaning for staff, and how different this crisis care is, and to really get that in the forefront of their brains. So Michelle did an amazing job helping us to get staff to understand what trauma is.
No, Molly. We're working on helping staff understand.
We're at a much better place than we were. And
actually, in the process of planning for this event, Anne admitted to us that she felt like it took about 7 years to infuse this culture into her work at Washburn. And that's a mental health agency, right? It was such a relief because, we really want to be clear, we're not up here going, we got this great model, we got this figured out. And that's been the most exciting part of this, is we go, looks like we got to tweak. Because if we want our staff to be responsive to the children and families, we have to be equally responsive to the staff. And so it's constant learning. And so, again, if you think of, as Molly said, if we can do this at the nursery, if we all allow ourselves to know this is a process, there's nothing magic here. It's just being intentional and thoughtful and patient and humble and curious. Why isn't this working? That kind of thing. So, sorry.
And as mental health providers, because some of our staff are, it's hard not to get stuck on the trauma itself. But we don't need to get stuck on the trauma. What we need to think about is what and why is this child acting this way? What kind of a what happened to you? Not in a sense of we need to know the details, but what has shaped your picture of the environment? and why are you responding in this way? So I think those were the skills that we're trying to translate for staff that are with the kids. And again, it's kind of challenging because we have 3 different shifts of staff who, some are full-time, some are part-time, some are on call. So getting everybody on board was quite a feat. And we're still working on it. We're constantly, doing the trainings and
We're training 26 volunteers tonight.
Yep. So that's the next level that we're at, and the volunteers are really interested in this and loving it. So it's, again, the ripple effect. More people will know about the work. So another key piece of this shift was we needed to get everybody on board. Our executive director attended the series of trainings. The board, Michelle and Ann have talked to the board on a couple of different occasions. Our child care staff, our family services staff, the advocates, and the home visitors all needed to participate in this baseline training and the building upon each of those. And like Michelle said, now we're training the volunteers too, because they have a really important role in this. Like Michelle said, when she walked in the room, that child had no idea. Was she a staff person? Was she a volunteer? Was she the executive director? But she knew that this person was supposed to be here and was supposed to be available to the child. And so volunteers are coming and going all the time, and they need to know how to respond to those needs of kids, because it's so different than how we parented our children, or how others parent their children, or the culture of parenting. So,
And I just want to point out the food manager, Keith.
yes.
I mean, and this is a matter of identifying who are the key people. Keith is this amazing guy who does the cooking and manages the food program. And every kid who comes there knows who Keith is. Keith knows who every kid is. And we started incorporating Keith in our planning meetings. He has been an invaluable resource. So again, it's not about the title. It's about
Right.
what function do you serve here for us?
Yep.
And the children.
So each shift, we tried to do it in cohorts of the shifts that staff were working, because we thought it would help to build some teamwork as well, which it has. And then they can help each other along, because they all know that they've heard the same thing. That's another piece of it. Our staff require a lot of training for our licensing. But prior to this, staff would go out, get trained, and a 2-hour training, come back, and be like, okay, so now how do I incorporate this? This time we said, okay, we're bringing the trainer in, and everybody's going to hear the same thing for an intensive amount of time. So we did 2-hour trainings, and each one was kicked off by Dr. Garrity, talking about stress and trauma, and then the strategies for working with that. So that was a really critical shift for us. We would bring trainers in on individual topics, but the trainers were never necessarily talking to each other, or how to implement this based on the nursery. Michelle came in and did a lot of observations in order to really understand the population that we're serving. We met over and over and over again to talk about what these needs are, what does it look like, how can we make a difference, what can we do, what can't we do.
I even observed the night shift.
She did, and they were very
clothes.
respected for doing that. So it's almost like this parallel process that we were bringing the staff in and treating them in a way that was very respectful, that was very engaging, and things like that. So in addition to that, as those trainings were going on, we recognized that there were some areas that really needed some significant attention. Our kids are in the dining room 6 times a day.
3 meals, 3
3
snacks.
meals, 3 snacks, and differing shifts approach meals. Everybody approaches food differently, and that's a very volatile area. It's very emotional. We all have different expectations around that culturally and developmentally, and all of those things. So we needed to set all of our own expectations aside and say, at the nursery, what's this meal, what is mealtime, snack time going to look like, so that all the kids hear the same thing, no matter if it's 10 in the morning or 7 o'clock at night. That shift in our focus was huge, so that everybody's talking the same language, and everybody has the same expectations of these kids, and the kids know what those expectations are. So those transitions, kids that are stressed, transitions are much harder for them. And transitioning in and out of care, in and out of play, back and forth to the gym, back and forth to the dining room, nap time, not nap time, all of those things, we just became much more intentional about talking about those things. In 5 minutes, we're going to leave the gym, and we're going to go have dinner, and then, you're going to see your friends, and blah, blah, blah. Another piece of it that's really, really challenging for our kids is the comings and goings of their group members. We have a 1-to-4 care ratio. And so kids are coming and going all the time, and they don't know. I mean, before, they don't know who's coming and going and who's going to be their teacher when they put them to bed and who's going to be their teacher when they wake them up. So we're talking about that more and being much more intentional about that. So,
and I also want to just say that as a person who does training, I mean, we know more, research is coming more and more clear that training in and of itself is not very effective. And what was so exciting for me and I learned so much in this process is Anne would do the first 2 hours about neurobiology of stress, and then some staff people there did some just developmental, 2 hours on developmental, and so that was four of the 12 hours. And then I had 4 2-hour trainings with each shift that piggybacked on that. But between those two, so I would come in and do a training, and then the next week I would come in and do an observation. And then the next week I would do a training. And so I could reference kids and staff and experiences that I saw. So it was kind of a combination of training and coaching and getting some credibility that I really appreciate and understand how incredibly hard the work is. Because it really is. So again, that was more of the humility part that I could come in and say, well, I think it should be this way. And they'd say, yeah, well, you come and see. And I'd come and see and go, oh, you're right. That's not going to work here, is it? So it's that kind of flexible interchange and attempt to be responsive with the staff. So for example, in the dining room where that came out, and to follow it with the reflective practice, because, so for example, when we made the rules in the dining room, which is kids can have as much as they want of everything except dessert and fruit juice. We had to do something for nutrition, right? But there was that, well, you can't have more chicken until you finish your potatoes. Nope, not here. You can have as much of anything as you want. So then to have a staff person come back to me and say, so you're telling me that I'm supposed to give my own 2-year-old daughter everything, as much as she wants of everything when she, nope, remember, this is different. When you set limits on your 2-year-old, that's exactly right. This is different, this is why it's different. But that comes up over and over again, because some of the stuff is counterintuitive to the way we parent, the way we were parented, that experience trumps training kind of thing. And so that's where to be able to integrate the observation, consultation, and in between the trainings. And then to develop new trainings, like training about the dining room or training about disclosure as it comes along. You were going to get there.
I just wanted to make sure that we did highlight the reflective consultation. Again, another piece that we hadn't done for our child care staff, which I had always wanted to do, but we never seemed to figure out a way to make it work. Our staff deals with some pretty challenging children and children that have experienced some pretty challenging events. And for them to have to hold all of that and not understand it and not be able to process their own emotions about it, I felt like it was a very, very big disservice to our staff. So Michelle provides the reflective consultation, which again, she's credible to them. She gets it, and she's very humble. Well, yeah, she is. No, but they have a deep respect for her because she's approached this work in a very respectful manner. So
Which
that
doesn't mean I don't get questioned.
Nope, and that's good. That's a good sign because they actually are looking at it and bringing her, and she's open to new learning. So I think.
So again, this is what we want children to experience, and parents for that matter, through this work. And again, as I said, that if they can have this experience at the nursery, then maybe that can create a model in their mind for the possibility that it can work that way in other places like school. So that's kind of the things that we try to keep top of mind in terms of what we're asking them to learn or teach. So it comes back to trying to let the staff know that they're not just, that they're organizing partners for the children, and that 3 things that can really affect how we respond to stress are controllability, predictability, and social supports, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But what does it mean to have an organizing relationship with a child? How do we, again, making transitions more intentional, organizing routines and environments. A transition isn't just a way to get from one activity to another. The transition is the curriculum. I can organize kids that I'm teaching them as much in terms of how much support I can offer them while we move from the gym to the dining room as anything else that I do all day, and trying to help staff be that intentional. And then organizing language. That has been something really useful. And I'm going to grab the handout. You have this handout in your packet on organizing language. But just to highlight a couple things, because working with these children can be so dysregulating for us as adults when we're dealing with children who are so dysregulated and whose cues are so confusing. So we introduce this notion of organizing language, but it's as much about organizing us as caregivers as it is about organizing the children. So rather than saying, stop climbing on the chair, you say, oh, I'm going to help you stop climbing on the chair because I want to keep you safe. So simply making that phrase, I'm going to help you stop, I'm going to help you not hit your friends, but it's about as much about the children experiencing us as being helpful in being a regulating, organizing partner. But for me as a caregiving adult, it helps me remember, oh, this kid's really getting to me, but I'm helping him when I set limits. And again, that may sound obvious, but it can really help kind of keep our own level of arousal modulated. Because
as we know, all of us get stressed, and what happens when we get stressed? We don't have those critical thinking skills. We can't think as quickly. So this kind of are quick reminders for all of us.
And it's a lot about emotional literacy. The organizing language is about, as the example Molly gave, I wonder if maybe you're missing your mom. I wonder if you're having such a hard time sitting still because maybe you're wondering, or maybe you're worrying, or maybe you're, we don't know, but we want to be able to begin to attach feeling words to children's state because they're just experiencing a state of arousal, whatever that may be. And if we can give them that whole, that feeling that you're feeling, that has a name. And if it has a name, maybe we can name it and tame it. If it has a name, then that tells you that, I get it. Oh, you're disappointed. You thought it was your turn. Oh, as opposed to going right for the, don't push your friend. It's not your turn. So again, it's just about that kind of intentionality in terms of the organizing language. So what we did was we made these phrases and we cut them out, and they're all over the walls, all over the nursery. So they're meant to be kind of just a reminder for staff and volunteers that I can fix my mistakes. Adults help me at the nursery. I will help you blank. All of those, I wonder if you're feeling blank. All those phrases, so they're all over the place in the nursery on the walls. The other thing is this notion of helping staff understand how critical the organizing is. For example, what I like to call kamikaze nose wiping. We got the toddler sitting there and her nose is, messy, and staff comes up behind her with a tissue and wipes her nose, and the kid goes, whoa! You say, well, maybe you should tell her you're going to wipe her nose. Well, she doesn't like to have her nose wiped. She'll cry. Well, how's this working? But to help the staff see, she may not like to have her nose wiped, but we want her to think the world is predictable. Oh, man, here she comes with that tissue. I hate that. But that's a very different experience than somebody sneaking up behind me and wiping my nose. And we do that all the time, right? That's not unusual. So helping staff see how even those very ordinary moments have profound value if we're using that trauma-informed lens. Why is it important to tell her I'm going to wipe her nose? And not only that, but from a neurological standpoint, here I come with the tissue, I'm going to wipe your nose. And even if we're talking about a baby, the baby may not understand the words, but here she comes. Unconsciously, I'm pulling it together. I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to have to be, something's coming. I'm going to have to be ready for it. So I can promote that internal resiliency just by signaling in some way the world is a predictable place. So, and the challenge of helping staff understand that. The other thing is self-awareness, and that's really working with the staff to help them be aware of their own reactions, and particularly with children who've experienced these, who've had these experiences. So for example, you have a child who says, "Shut up, bitch." Now, if I'm a staff person, and this is a 4-year-old kid, and I'm in a profession that doesn't have a whole lot of status anyway, right? I'm a child care provider. And now this kid is doing this, I'm going to have a reaction to that. And a 4-year-old is not going to be telling me that. Or I may have a reaction that says, my cultural experience says that if this little African-American boy goes out on the street talking like that, he's going to be in big trouble. And the best thing I can do for him is to get that stopped in its tracks right now. And I'm doing that in that child's best interest. As opposed to helping staff understand that, "Shut up, bitch." Whoa, that kid is telling us something really important. That is a terrified child. And how do we help staff, if they can't be aware of their own internal reaction to that kind of behavior, how are they going to be able to shift it to be as helpful to that child as they can? "Oh, wow, those words are really scary. Wow, you know what? We're going to keep you safe at the nursery. So at the nursery, we won't use those scary words. We're going to keep you safe, and we're going to keep your friends safe. So we're not going to use those scary words." So that's a huge shift, and that's where I think patience and humility. I mean, because how do we? And again, that's where the reflective consultation comes in, so that there's a safe place to process our internal reactions to some of these outrageous behaviors, because that's a we're asking staff in many ways to do what to them is a counterintuitive response, right? If my own kid calls me a bitch, that's one issue. I mean, I will have a set of responses as a parent, but I'm asking you not to address first and foremost that negative behavior. We're asking you to acknowledge your own response, see past it, and think, "Oh, what has happened to this child?"
And I think what's really key and what's different about this is having the space to acknowledge their own response, and to be aware of that, and then to have a place to talk about it that's safe, because it's okay to have that
Yep.
knee-jerk reaction. Like,
Yep.
"What are you thinking?" We have no idea what that staff came to work with that day, and so those responses we need to acknowledge them. We need to and help them reshape that, and to say it's okay to have that feeling, but what can we do with it so that the child can have a better experience? So it's a big addition to the work that we're doing now.
Right. The other thing I think is that really is so much easier said than done is this idea of helping staff take multiple perspectives. And it has to be clear that their perspective counts just as much as everybody else in the situation. And by taking the perspective, it's like, what's it like to be this child? When that child said that to you, what do you think was going on? What was it like? What did that behavior feel like on the inside for that child? What do you think was going on? And again, this is away from the situation and helping the staff try to see what was the child's perspective there? What do you think might have happened that was his response? And this is really key. What's it like to be the other children? So if I'm a staff working with a 1-to-4 ratio and I've got this going on, I'm probably not thinking a lot about these other 3 kids. And this is where we tell the volunteers they can be really, really crucial, is because if we measure the cortisol levels on those other children in response to the kid who's misbehaving, they're really high too. They're going, "Oh God, what's going to happen? Oh man, how's this adult going to react?" But we don't think about those other children when we're responsible for this child in this moment, and it's a pretty crucial situation. So it's helping staff say, well, what do you think it was like for the other children when that kid called you that and was so angry? Wow, well, I bet that was scary for those other kids. I bet they were wondering, how is she going to respond? Are we going to get hurt? All those things. So then the other staff in the gym are more mindful, because it would be, not typically staff, there would be more than one staff in a larger setting. The other staff can use that as a teaching opportunity. You know what? He's having a hard time. But see, his teacher's helping him. She's keeping him safe, and we're going to keep you safe too. So what's it like for those other children? And just trying to increase that awareness. What's it like to be the volunteer, or what's it like to be the parent? And then what's it like to be you? What's it like for you when that child says that? Or what's it like for you when your group of 4 kids just happens to be the magic mix? And that happens, right? So trying to, again, that's a way to promote self-awareness, because it's that parallel process. If the staff doesn't feel supported and like their perspective counts, how can we ask them to be empathic to the children if they don't feel that the staff, that supervisors and administration is empathic to their situation and how hard they're working? So a recent example, and I think this is, to me, this is like the nursery at its best, was a parent came in with her 4- and 5-year-old children. These children had been there a number of times. And during the intake, the child care supervisor comes over and they say goodbye to mom, and she takes them over to the child care part while the family advocate is continuing to interview the mom. This mom says, well, just so you know, you're going to notice she's got a bruise. Her arm is bruised because I beat her with a belt. Whew. And she tells the family advocate a story about why she beat her with a belt. Now, that mom has been to the nursery many times. That mother knows that we're mandated reporters. That mother,
we tell them that every single time they place,
yes.
just so they're aware.
That mother is saying, I'm out of control, help me. Okay, so the family advocate gets that, and the family advocate says, you know, we're going to have to report this to child protection. Now, I can do that after you leave, or we can sit and do it together. What do you think? Mom says, let's do it together. And they do. They do it together. And on the other side of the building, in the child care, staff they're changing the child's clothes. They see this bruise, and they are horrified, right? So in reflective consultation, this story came up. And one shift had a little more information than the other about the parent. What turned out, the parent's explanation for what had happened was not really what had happened. She'd coached the child to say this happened, that mom hit her with the belt because she was making her letters wrong when they were doing an activity. In fact, what had happened was the mother had come in on the 2 siblings, engaging in what we would consider developmentally appropriate behavior, was a trauma trigger for this mom. So mom, that trauma trigger, and she had her flight or fight moment, but she was too ashamed to even admit what that was. So now we're in reflective consultation and we're dealing with the staff, and we want these child care teachers to feel protective of these children. They can't do their job if they're not that committed and that invested in these children with whom they're doing intimate physical care and forming these very intimate relationships, particularly for the children who come over time. Staff is angry. They are angry at mom. How could she do this? And yet, in the context of reflective consultation, we can say, you know, it seems there's a little more to the story. And it's always a balance between respecting the family's privacy. It's a need-to-know basis. But how do we help the staff? How do we engender some sympathy for the mother from the child care staff, at the same time acknowledging their own grief and distress that this child that they care so much about has been hurt? So I think that's the complexity, and yet, you know, I think that's a story that, for me, is the nursery at its best, that the mom felt safe enough that she could come and let them know she needed the help, and in fact, she's being connected to resources, and the child gets supported, and the staff can try to have that empathy for both the mother and the child, which requires them to move through their own initial reaction. So I just said I want to, this briefly, just that this is from Megan Gunner, actually has a chapter in this curriculum sold through 0 to 3 called Early Development in the Brain. But this thing about how these things can help us manage stress, and that's true for any of us. If you walked into work on Monday morning and your boss went up to you and said, "You're moving desks, and you're moving right over there." Woo! Now, same thing. You walk in on Monday morning, or you walk in on Friday, and the boss says, "Oh, I am so sorry, but we're going to have you move your desk on Monday morning." So when you come in on Monday morning, it's going to feel a whole lot different because you knew. It's the same thing. You still have to change your desk and you don't want to do it. But because it's predictable, it's going to be much less stressful. And if she says, "And you can pick this spot or you can pick that spot. Which one do you want?" Aha, I have some control. So again, it's all this stuff we're talking about the kids need. It's biology. It applies to all of us. And so the other thing is that if we understand part of our work as also promoting the children's social skills with each other, again, think child care, not just crisis nursery, that children who have more positive peer relationships have lower stress in group settings. So again, it's promoting, we're not just teaching kids to get along and not hit each other, we're actually relieving and we're building resiliency in these children by facilitating their social skills with each other as well and being mindful of that. I think we've made that point, but I think Anne says it so well, just that again, we can't underestimate how disorganizing it is for us as adults to be with children who are this disorganized. And which is why the staff needs so much support to be able to do this work.
So in a very short amount of time, we're going to talk about, and we can answer some more questions after the break, but really about how did we apply all of this in very specific ways. It's about what we ask and how we ask it. Some of the new work that we're doing is around parenting and asking some questions about how parenting is going for them. Something that we had never done before. Something that we were a little bit concerned that might be invasive, that might be too much to know, that might be too much work, that wasn't really our role. What we found, though, is that based on the protective factors and the child development piece, it was an opportunity for us to kind of look at the relationship between the parent and child and acknowledge some of the things that they're really doing that are well, and intentionally pointing those things out. So one of the things that we ask, and I think it might be on another screen, but is what works when your child's upset? Well, okay, let me think about it. What worked yesterday when he was upset? And it gives that parent that power. So again, it's that strengths-based perspective. We also now ask parents about any victimization concerns that the child has experienced in the context of how can we best care for this child. And so it allows us the opportunity to talk about any domestic violence that the child has witnessed, so that what are some triggers that he might experience here that would previous to then be pretty out of the ordinary. We ask about if they've experienced any child abuse or neglect, or if there's been any violence in the community. It's not about needing to know the details behind this. It's about what has this child experienced, like the little girl that I talked about who witnessed her dad on the floor with a police officer who's supposed to be a good person with a gun to his back. What has she experienced that might demonstrate some pretty significant trauma reactions while she's in our care, because she's even more stressed now that she's removed from her primary caregiver. So those victimization concerns has really given us a new opportunity and much more intentional care. We contract with the parent. We do a lot of goal setting around early childhood indicators of early childhood. That's based on the Department of Human Services, and we have the parents help us set some goals for their kids while they're here around social emotional development, around health and hygiene, around communication. And they're developmentally set up so that the parent then has that opportunity to learn more. And some of the questions that we might ask, do they need help around falling asleep. You know, how are they falling asleep? And identifying that it's okay for a 2-year-old to need help getting to sleep. Now, as the parent of, you know, maybe she's got multiple children, that might not work so well at home, but she still becomes aware that it's okay and that this child is intentionally doing something to make her mad, which is a lot of times, as a parent, we all know that sometimes it feels like that's intentionally triggered at us. So I talked about the special care needs a little bit, and then the parenting questions. It's a series of questions. Sometimes the parents don't have time or aren't ready to engage in that, but it's become kind of a routine part of our intake, and they get it. So I think
so it's just by being very intentional about how we ask the question of the parents, we may be planting a seed that this is I don't know how I can help them feel better. But it's trying to bring some of that stuff to the top of mind for the parent, as well as giving us additional information.
Again, because we have that opportunity, they are voluntarily bringing them to us, and so that relationship, that trust relationship, has already been established, and it builds on that. Part of what we do is all of the staff document throughout the day what the child's mood was like. What were some coping skills that the child demonstrated while they were in our care? These are outcomes that have been proven to help reduce child abuse and neglect and also raise resiliency in children. These are things that we can report on to funders. And so it's kind of like this domino circular effect that as we can report on these things, staff are becoming much more aware of the impact that they can have on their kids, increasing their competence. So all of these things are really, really helpful. And then at the same time, then, we include all of that information in a brief discharge summary that the parent gets and help the parents understand that this is what we're doing here. You can do these things at home. It's all very ordinary things.
And it's written like a social story.
Yeah.
So it might be something a parent could even read to their child. When I was at the nursery, da-da-da-da-da-da.
And it's also then renaming kind of some of those really important key indicators that will help the child develop and learn. Which Katie will talk about after the break.
And it's even as simple as Anne uses the example is, do you know your child really knows how to brush his teeth well? So, well, if he knows how to brush his teeth well, that means he knows how to follow directions, he knows how to move with a group, he knows how to follow a routine. What important skills those are to be ready for kindergarten. So it's helping parents connect the dots in the way we report what goes on at the nursery.
And it's increasing the competency in the staff and the children. So it's kind of all of this is part of the process. In addition, we also do a discharge survey asking the parents about their experience with us. And one of the questions becomes, did we help them understand child development? And our indicators are really rising. So that was a huge piece because it hadn't always been that way. I think
we're almost out of time, but I think, you know, in terms of lessons learned, it just to really reiterate over and over, this is a work in progress, and it will always be a work in progress, and that helps a lot, keeping that mindset for ourselves. But you know how we work with staff resistance. Change is hard. Change is really hard. And I think we've talked about how that notion in childcare in particular, experience trumps training. That's not how I was raised, that's not how I raised my kids, and that's the first place I go. That's where I regress when I'm faced with a challenging situation. And try to normalize that and say, we're working on it, and we're offering reflective consultation and multiple opportunities to try to integrate the new learning that we're asking people to do in terms of the trauma lens. I think the cultural issues come up. That happens between one shift happens to be folks who've been there much longer versus another shift that tends to be people who are newer. They also tend to be, more people in that shift happen to be white, and more people in the other shift happen to be African American, and sometimes that comes through in how they feel about how the other shift is handling situations, all for good reasons. And so we have to just kind of keep those issues on the table and alive, and it's okay to talk about this because it sure is, it's part of what we're doing here, it's part of our work. and helping especially the family staff learn to talk about the hard stuff, as Molly said. I don't want to bring that up. I don't want to ask the mother if her child has witnessed domestic abuse because I might offend her. Well, it turns out that it hasn't happened yet. The parents are eager. It's like,
somebody gets it. They're demonstrating that they're coming to us, they're telling their story, and we get it, and we can hold it all. So it's using that strengths-based perspective as far as acknowledging, empowering, making sure they get that they're doing a lot of really good things, and validating the experiences that have brought them to us. So I think that that's a really important piece of the work that took us, it took us a lot to get from here to there. So.
Yep. And requires ongoing support in a reflective consultation and other things. So again, I think we've covered this, but see, patience and humility still there. And I don't mean that lightly. That has been really important learning for me. Can't you get it? Can't you just see how No, we can't, that's not how this kind of change works, and learning that patience and respect for the work that the staff is doing and how really hard that work is. And then intentionality, just that our most powerful interventions happen in the most everyday kinds of moments and routines if we keep that top of mind and stay intentional about it. How about a break? All right.
So if you have questions, write them down, because that's how after the break is going to start. So write them down, and we'll address some of those questions after the break. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for coming back. We really appreciate it.
You come back.
We just have a couple things we want to make sure that people understand. As you know, this is being webcasted across the state. Thank you very much, all of those other sites out there. If you have questions and you're outstate, make sure and send them to this email address, and we will try to filter them as we go. The email address, or the website, is www.cmhdata.umn.edu. So hopefully you guys got that. I'll repeat it once more if we have time for more questions. But really appreciate you guys tuning in, and I understand that there probably are some challenges in going at it that way. Also, we are going to be doing a blog following this for a week, so we'll talk more about that at the end. But questions will also be responded to at that time. For those of you that are here in the metro area, we have some questions that have already been started, but if you have a question, make sure and use the microphone so that not only the people in this room hear you, but also the people outstate can hear as well. So with that, no further ado, we'll get started on a few questions. We want to save a lot of time for Katie, because she has so much to offer us as far as the impact on learning as well. So she's going to kind of, the whole goal of this is to tie research to practice. So that's what we're doing. So we will get started. You want to take that first one?
Sure. I think somebody had a question about the families that we serve. Actually, that would be better for you. That why are they so, they're 90% are living on $10,000 a year or less, and why is this? Are they teens?
As far as the teen population, the average age that we serve over the course of a year, the average age is 27, which seems a little bit high, but we do serve a number of teens. We also serve some caregivers that are actually the child's grandmother, and so the age kind of gets skewed. I would say one of the biggest reasons why these families are in the state that they are in is because of some of the experiences that they had as children, and what we're learning about that impact, and because that they weren't cared for with a trauma lens in any of their environments. So they may have been in out-of-home placements. A number of our families did experience abuse as children, which a number of them have chronic mental health issues and or substance abuse, which they all just partnered in, and these are responses to trauma. And
historical trauma is huge in this population, culturally. Historical trauma is huge.
A lot of domestic violence experiences. So these things just kind of build on each other, and when you don't know how and you haven't learned how to cope with these things, we develop some kind of male adaptive coping strategies that become disenfranchising and creates that domino effect. So hopefully.
I love this question from Grant County. What is the name of the tool used when parents set intake to facilitate goal setting?
And it is on the DHS website. It's early. I can never. I have a mental block.
It's not an instrument. Molly, we made the instrument with the input of the child care staff, but it's all based on the early indicators of progress that's on the Minnesota website.
Department of Health's website.
So those indicators of progress, what we hope to see in young children is readily available, and then we selected from that depending on, in a way that was intentional about, for example, having it be a toddler goes to sleep with adult support, so that it's telling the parent that, oh, it's a toddler, of course we would expect needing adult support, that kind of thing.
And some of the kind of the adaptations that we made to that was just to make sure that it was a language that parents understood and that they could relate to. So, and that the child care. So it was a series of meetings that we kind of got to from point A to point B, but it's based on those early indicators of progress. So hopefully that helps, and it really has drastically changed our work. So good question.
It's another question from Duluth about, would it be better to surprise nose wipe and then teach the child that life has surprises, but that's okay? But that's a very good question, because if that were your child, that would be a reasonable thing, right? But this is different. These are children who life is one big surprise. There's nothing about their lives that isn't surprising. To some extent, we can make that assumption. Certainly the fact that they're in the nursery. So the nursery is the place to do everything we can to be intentionally predictable. So again, the question is a great example of that's a very reasonable question, and if it in all things, a secure child, familiar environment, that is a good teaching opportunity, not for these children in this setting.
I just have to say there are some really awesome questions here. Okay, another question that came from Rochester is, how can this model of childcare be expanded to ongoing childcare for children in chronic stress? How can the nursery way culture be infused in childcare centers in high-risk neighborhoods or more locations? So I guess how we would probably respond to that is that this lens can be portably lifted and worked through in all sorts of settings, and how wonderful it would be if the kids were receiving this kind of approach to childcare everywhere. So that's one of our long-term goals, is to be able to try to figure out how to make this work, because it just makes the work that much stronger and actually that much more successful. So,
and Molly, there are a couple questions about follow-up in the home visiting program.
Okay. Yeah, because somebody else had that question as well. Can you describe the services after the children stay for 3 nights? What is the crisis nursery involvement afterwards with home visiting? There's also some questions around what do the parents need to do while the kids are in our care. We always they identify what the crisis is, and basically it revolves around emotional exhaustion. They're just wiped out. It's homelessness or near homelessness issues, it's domestic violence, it's mental health issues. They tell us what's going on, and then we get them the support that they need. They always need to identify, and have always had to identify one goal that they would be working on while the kids were in our care. It can be as simple as a new mom who hasn't gotten enough sleep, and she's got 3 other kids that she can't meet their needs. And so their goal may be go home and get some rest, and that's okay. And to give them that permission is awesome. So it also can be something around, finding homes, or finding a place to live, or connecting with a mental health resource, or going to court, or whatever it is, and then we'll help connect them with that resource that they need to get that happen. We check in with them when they pick up and find out how close they got to meeting that goal, and what else do they need to meet that goal. So again, it's always that partnering process that we work with. So that's the piece of it. Home visiting, we offer that through our nursery. We have licensed mental health professionals that do meet with families in the home. They're referred by our family advocate staff. Typically, if a family's used us a few times, that demonstrates that they're needing more than just those 3 days. If they don't have other resources that are meeting those needs, we will offer them the home visiting. If they're interested, then we will partner with them. Our home visiting is it's based It's based on the David's Old model, which is a nurse home visit model, but it's not a nurse home visit model because the nurse home visit model is prenatal. Well, we have the kids, so the parent has already had the child. So it's along those same lines as far as duration and intensity. So they meet with the families for at least once a week for about 12 to 18 months. The parent identifies the goals. One of the goals, though, now is always around parenting and that parent-child attachment relationship. And so that's our home visiting. We currently are serving, I think, about 50 families in our home visiting model, and it's proven to be very successful. We have some outcomes around that. And another question was around funding, and we have a variety of funding sources that help to support us. The United Way is a big funder, Hennepin County is a big funder, and then a number of foundations, and lots and lots and lots of individual donors who we got a lot of community support.
Are there questions out here that we're just doing the ones in writing? Yes.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that you explained that you're mandated reporters every time a family comes in. What is like the policy and procedure if a kid does disclose, or when a kid does disclose? Do you take them out of the nursery, or what do you do then?
We have a pretty detailed procedure around that. What I wanted to make sure is that all of the parents understand that we're not judging them if there is a suspicion for abuse and neglect. And so part of what we do is ask the families before they come in what marks they have on their body and how they got them. So because kids have marks all over for all sorts of reasons. And but if a child does present with a suspicious mark, or a child discloses that something happened other than what mom had said, we will call we partner. The children's services and the family services staff always partner to call child protection, and then we let it go. We have to let it go and let child protection decide how they're going to manage that, which is sometimes really hard because there's a lot of things that get screened out right now, and that's hard as a provider to be able to move past that. But we do a lot of work around letting go. We can do what we can do, then we have to trust the other systems. So again, it's always that parallel process. So.
And that requires a lot of staff support, because these staff have relationships with these, not just the children, but also the parents, and so it's very hard. And the implied message whenever possible is, and we will be with you every step of the way. You hired us to keep your child safe. This is part of keeping her safe. It looks, and we will be with you every step of the way.
And I do believe, just really quickly, that sometimes parents' only option to get their child safe is to bring their child to us, and they know that we'll take that next step.
Like the mom we described recently.
And she couldn't make that call by herself, or she may have somebody at home that's telling them, something terrible is going to happen to you. So sometimes I think, especially for those families that use us a lot, they hear it so much, they know if they get their kid to us, we will get that child safe. So that's all the time we have. Can you write it down and throw it on the blog, because we do want to.
We have another chance.
We do have another
Katie's,
chance.
we're going to have another Q&A.